so-called white passing, crossing the color line. It stirs up a lot of emotions. There are living people who are hurting right now. These people are literally in their 90s. I'm talking about who are still hurt over something like this. Culture that's not healed, and we're just beginning to try to treat some of these deep, deep wounds. Yeah, I guess we just never address these things. So my name is Jeremy Simien. I'm Louisiana based, and I am an art and antique collector and a Louisiana Creole and a Louisiana Creole historian.
How do you know that you're Creole? Like, how do you know that's true?
Well, I know it's true because I've chosen that identity. Identity was somewhat imposed upon me as well because my family used this word. I would come to find out that there wasn't an actual consensus on what Creole meant amongst all of them, but there was a generally accepted idea, and we knew it had to do with cultural identity. But some people thought it had to do a little with this, a little with that. Therein lies the complication of Louisiana Creole.
The horrible cliche of like, it's like a gumbo. Like, yes, it is, but it's also a unique identity in a lot of ways. It seems like there is like a defining, you have to have X. Uh, what would that be for you or your family?
So if you're asking me as a historian right now, what I would say these specific things are, that would probably be a different answer than if you would have asked me 10 to 15 years ago when I was just beginning to understand my family history. Louisiana is not like anywhere else. Louisiana was Louisiana when the United States was becoming the United States and after it became the United States. We were a foreign entity, territory, colony, and the people that were here, and they were not American. They did not speak English. And they didn't really think about speaking English because they didn't need to. Many or most people spoke French in
Mm.
Louisiana. So we have to look at the kind of the early history of Louisiana and realize that there was this great fusion that happened, not just ethnically, but culturally. And when we look at the descendants of those people who carried on these traditions and carried on the word Creole to denote their culture and their uniqueness, and in a way, their separateness from the United States. I think many people who use the word Creole have an essence of what it means, but don't necessarily have a clear idea. So some people believe, well, I'm mixed race, my parents speak French, and by mixed race, I don't mean one race or this, I just mean their background, their ancestry is this and that and that. So I'm Creole.
Mhm.
But really, when you scratch away and you look deeper, it is cultural, not racial. But because there were so many mixed race people who said they were Creole, it stuck. So anybody who kind of looked a certain way would receive that designation, Creole. With that stigma came a schism in identity. People who previously who were of majority European ancestry or even all European ancestry without African, without indigenous ancestry, shied away from that during some of our turbulent learning times, we'll call them, stepped away from that. Some people say, oh, well, we're French, or we're Creole, but we're white Creoles.
Mm. I would not have thought that we had Creole roots, except for the fact that I know that my mom's grandmother's first language was French and not regular French. It was, I've heard them call it Cajun French and it's Creole French, it's Creole, it's all whatever. And to me, I feel like language is so important as such an indicator. It's because Creole is such a combination that I'm not sure, can you be Creole and affiliated with a tribe? Can you be Creole and consider yourself just I'm African American and Creole, or I'm Native and Creole? Or do you feel like it's more all encompassing? You're just all in with
So
that.
that's a deep question. And I really believe, and I believe this, it's been this way for some time, that you can be an African American, identify as African American, and say, but I'm a Creole. You can be a white identifying American with some black ancestry, and I believe you can say you're a Creole. You can be just a mixed race person and say you're a Creole, but not be referring at all to your racial identity.
Mm,
Because again, so for some people, it's easier for them racially to say they're Creole. And I think secretly they're hoping you fill in gaps, or they're under this idea that Creole refers to mixed race people, specifically in this case from Louisiana.
right.
We're living in a very unusual time, right? Where we're beginning to look at things not in a binary way. Yeah, we just can't jump over this black white thing. We can't. There are people with blonde hair and blue eyes who maybe have very little African ancestry and they say they're African American. They choose not to use the word Creole, but have what we would consider Creole roots, colonial roots pre 1803 in Louisiana, French speaking, the works. Some of these people have my same last name. Some of these people are my cousins. Who says they can't be who they know they are?
Just to play devil's advocate, I kind of wanted to go into this and have someone just tell me who I was. I was like, I don't even have the answer. I was like, where do I go? Which, is not the world I want to live in. But when I'm talking about for myself, I was hoping that it was a little bit more like you would just know. White passing seems to be a really big deal in the Creole community. And I just watched a interview with a woman who spoke about it in Creole families. Like almost every single Creole family has a story about at least one white passing relative. Why?
Well, first off, I have grandparents who are still alive, so I'll be delicate in pointing out which one of their relatives or the relationship of relatives have done that. But I can tell you, in my grandparents' generation, we certainly have cousins who have crossed the color line. I don't say white passing; people say passé blanc, and some of them talk to us, and some do not. That's a problem.
I like the phrase crossing the color line because I remember reading that in one of Elizabeth Shown Mills' articles from the genealogist, and it stuck with me. She was talking in particular about the area where my great grandmother was born, Campty. So a lot of families who were able to cross the color line did. Like it seems extremely prevalent in Creole community, part of the experience almost.
So-called Creoles of color who are mixed race as their own thing. And I think later on, things became a little more narrow in that you're this or that. And I think some people never felt comfortable with that. Whereas earlier on, you said, I wish it was just simple, like someone would just tell me. And that comes maybe from a place of a little bit of freedom and not having people, I'm sure you've had people ask you what you are, but not people question your identity. But from my perspective and other people who are in Louisiana, people will question your identity. And you say, oh, I'm a Creole. They become very charged by that and become very angry by that. There's reasons. So-called white passing, crossing the color line. It stirs up a lot of emotions. Stirs up the idea that some family just pieced out, didn't send a postcard, a Christmas card, and never came back to visit. That hurts. That hurts a lot. Maybe even worse in some ways than the death of a family member, because this person's living maybe perfectly fine without you, and you're not living perfectly fine without them. The word Creole, I think, has had a stigma on it at a time, and a lot of it was aligned with colorism. And colorism is a problem in communities of color, and specifically in communities of people of African descent. A person can be your color, look like you very much, of same phenotypes, identify as black, of course, right? But then there's some people who are 3 shades darker than myself and say, oh no, I'm not African American, I'm not black, I'm this or that. What happens is because of these ideas of superiority, white superiority, right? Racial hierarchy. And a lot of what has happened in communities of color is we see preferential treatment, accessibility, and opportunity with people who look more in line with people who have historically oppressed. It's not explicit, it's implicit bias. I think some dark-skinned people of African descent see a person, maybe even such as myself, and say, I bet he thinks he's better than me. And then some people like myself who look like me see a darker skinned person and says, I bet that person is looking down on me, thinking that I'm not going to, take their side and I think I'm better than them. We're hurt people, a culture that's not healed. And we're just beginning to try to treat some of these deep, deep wounds. Yeah, I guess we just never address these things. And I think in all of that, if we unravel all of this, we'll figure out what the real issue here is. The issue is hurt feelings, feelings of betrayal, and feelings of longing, and lost. And little
Oh, I feel like I could cry. Our families down there, we didn't know these people even existed. What do you feel like are some of the unique challenges then faced by a Creole community? Because you're saying, there's this obvious, like, what happens when people have left the community, or grading people on how dark or light are you, and where do you fit in this hierarchy? How does it get fixed? Like, what do you do?
things that's being fixed is somebody's being transparent about it. Someone saying, "Hey, you know what? I should make some YouTube videos and talk about this and share their family experience," because that opens up dialogue for people, and it makes the subject not as taboo. I'm telling you, this subject right here that we're talking about, I don't think anybody would have participated in this sort of thing 30 years ago, and not necessarily because they would have been afraid of being run out of town, but because it was too close to so many bad things that happened. There's a sibling, not my sibling, but a family member's sibling who does not speak to the family. The person has made a decision that proximity to people like us who look like us puts a spotlight on them, and so they decided to step away from this family, and this happened a number of years ago. At one time they did associate, and they do not anymore, and it's very, but that still hurts. That hurts. There are living people who are hurting right now. These people are literally in their 90s, I'm talking about, who are still hurt over something like this. Creoles of color, when we're talking about, and I'm using the term Creole in the sense to describe as mixed race people, I'm using this term again. We've always been kind of close knit in the sense of, because we were in this strange, ambiguous place racially, sometimes, depending on where you are, the community, and how you looked, and how you felt, and how you identified, and how the family identified. For a while, it seemed people were very close knit. You would see allied families marrying each other. Well, a lot of that changed after the civil rights movement. People began to marry outside of this bubble. Thank God, right? Um, thank God. So all these people went to cities. They went to Lake Charles.
Mm,
That showed up, I think, on your ancestry. They
yeah.
went to Lake Charles. Some of them went to Beaumont. They basically, and really all over, but in Louisiana, they left these little cities. And what happens is you see brothers and sisters marrying different types of people, and you see families looked very similar, began to look a little different. Some had darker members and this and this, and I think a lot of colorism came in to that
Mm.
too. And I think there's a lot of hurt feelings. Some people with darker skin were treated very poorly by people of fairer skin, and they were made to feel inferior. And they were also made, most importantly, to feel they could not be Creole. So when they hear that word today, there's still a lot of hurt that they believe you're using to be an exceptional, an
Mm.
exception, but something better than whatever.
There's a habit in my family, and I'm just gonna say it from my perspective. I put on SPF 50 in the winter. I never go a day without sunscreen. My mom said, never skip your sunscreen. Never skip your sunscreen. Learn behaviors like this. And I think it's interesting. We're in New York, and my family learned that you don't want to be in the sun a lot. Or if you're in the sun, make sure you're doing all this stuff. A lot of people, even my very fair friends, do not wear SPF 50 in the winter. I remember saying something one time, and they were like, "What? What do you do?" I was like, "Oh, it's just my mom told me to." I mean, I'm about as far from Creole culture as possible. I grew up in New York, I don't know French, but I am curious, what are some of those kinds of things that you see come up in families where, like, I don't know how else to say it. I feel like it's almost like these learned behaviors.
I do notice some consistency in these people who cross the color line. One, I have found, a little uh, paranoid of the sun. And a lot of them will say, and you've heard this, my mom always wore a hat. Didn't
Yes.
like to get in the sun.
Verbatim, verbatim.
A friend of mine who has some mixed ancestry saying that as kids, someone had pointed out to her mother that this pool is not for colored people. And her grandmother was, "What? We're not colored." But evidently, after a few days in the sun, they were. Some of my grandparents were less interested in talking about our past and our history because one, they were hoping it was behind us, the darker chapters. And I'm not talking about our African ancestry, but I'm talking about Jim Crow and all of this awful stuff that happened. And they also saw that some of the grandchildren were probably going to have a different identity than the way they had chosen. And so they didn't want to get too much into that. My grandparents didn't teach my parents to speak French. They thought it would hold them back, and they thought it was a vestige of an old world that they were trying to get away from. And they were getting away from it because they were being told that you needed to get out of that. You needed to get away from that. A lot of that was imposed, this loss of identity.
What does it look like to reconnect? Can you really, like, can you make up for not having grown up with I don't know.
So some cousins who grew up as white identifying and grew up in places where they were accepted as white later discover their ancestry, discover some of their African ancestry, and discover their Creole heritage. And some of them feel uncomfortable saying I'm Creole because they feel like it's usurping or culturally appropriating. I don't feel that way. Some people may feel that way. They'll say, listen, you didn't go through what we had to go through. Y'all left. Maybe you don't get to wear that. You don't get to claim that.
I think it's the tension of, I respect that I did not have the same experience, but I also don't want people to feel like, well, she's rejecting us, because tension is,
I hear you.
no, you know what I mean? Like, no, I would never reject my race. I'm so proud of them. But I also respect how I grew up was not how you grew up. That is kind of where I'm at. And so my personal take has just been, I just don't say I'm anything. And
You're not responsible for what your ancestors did. And what your ancestors did is not something that we can actually, in present day, judge. We haven't lived that life. We haven't seen the climate that we've read about that was so tragic, where you had to, be afraid to be found out as a person of color. So I would say to you, and this is just one person's opinion, because I do think, not to get really Sigmund Freud on you, but I do believe
I love it. That's okay.
you're not asking permission to identify racially, but you're making it clear to say, listen, I recognize my African ancestry and my Creole identity, but I also recognize that I did not grow up in this culture. My life experience has been very different, but I want y'all to know that I have respect for this culture, and I want to be a part of it, but you are a part of it.
Oh gosh, I want to try. I'm like, I did not think I was going to get emotional talking.
I'll speak for myself. I appreciate what you're doing. This transparency is important, and you are sharing our culture, and you're sharing a part of our story. And when I say our, I mean our. I would love to continue to help. This is a journey, obviously.
As transparent as possible, which is scary to be vulnerable, be hiding in like the my Black ancestry group trying to figure it out. And then I'm over here in a Mexican group figuring out, and you're kind of like, you're everywhere, but you're nowhere. And
I hear you on that.
but I don't know, there's something kind of beautiful about that. Like a special Louisiana thing.
I think it's a special Louisiana thing, and our descendants, 100 years from now, think of our descendants. Will some be speaking Mandarin? Will some be speaking French? Will some be speaking English? So they'll all be Creole descendants.